Hey, you. Yes, you. The one who said it was over and then checked your partner or ex partner, or maybe the ex slash partner, whichever one it is. But you checked their Instagram story anyway, didn't you? Well, welcome back to Hearts Wine from Hearts Distractions, where we unpack the messiness, the beauty, and sometimes the straight up confusion of relationships. Of course, I'm your host, Alicia Minor Gaines, licensed marriage and family therapist, relationship coach, and your favorite truth teller when it comes to love. Now, today's episode, whew, y'all, this one right here is for the couples who said, we need space, and then realized space can get real quiet at night. We're talking about something that people whisper about, but don't always admit publicly. From separation to reconciliation, is getting back together a good idea? Because let's be honest, breakups aren't always clean. Separation isn't always final. And sometimes love doesn't leave, it just waits. But here's the tension. Are you going back because you've both grown? Or are you going back because you're uncomfortable alone? Are you rebuilding love or repeating trauma? And listen, I'm not judging either way. As a marriage and family therapist, I've worked with couples who separated and came back stronger than ever. I've also worked with couples who reconciled 3 times and called it destiny when it was really dysfunction wearing a cute outfit. Y'all heard me say it. So today, we're going to break this down with honesty, research, humor, and compassion for all couples. Whether you're dating, engaged, married, in a same-sex relationship, navigating co-parenting, or trying to decide if your ex deserves access to your Netflix password again. Because sometimes reconciliation is healing, and sometimes it's just unfinished business. Can we talk about it? Let's get into it. But before we can even talk about getting back together, we have to ask the question that most couples avoid. Why did you separate to begin with? Because separation doesn't usually happen because someone forgot to take the trash out. That's the argument. That's not the reason. Most separations happen because of accumulated emotional disconnection. Whew, that was a mouthful, y'all. Research from the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy indicates that communication problems remain the number one reported issue in couples seeking therapy. But let's be clear, communication problems rarely mean we don't talk. It usually means we talk, but we don't feel heard. We argue, but nothing changes, and we apologize, but behavior stays the same. Woo! How many of y'all felt me on that one? Sometimes separation comes after emotional neglect. One partner feels invisible, the other feels criticized, and instead of addressing it, both retreat into survival mode. Other times, well, separation is triggered by betrayal. Emotional affairs, physical infidelity, financial secrecy, and yes, emotional cheating counts because trust isn't just about bodies, it's about loyalty. Then there's the quiet separations, the ones where couples grow apart, careers expand, kids arrive, stress increases, intimacy declines, and suddenly you look at the person you married and think, I love you, but I don't know if I like who you've become. I know some of y'all are like, she is starting early today. Well, y'all know I got to give y'all the stuff early, but I'm also hit you with it later. So to bring this home a little bit, y'all know, I want to give y'all a couple that I once worked with. Let's call them Maya and Jordan. So this particular couple was married for about 12 years, 2 kids, No dramatic betrayal, no screaming matches, just slow drifting. So Maya said one day, I feel alone in this marriage. While Jordan said, I thought providing was enough. Because most men think that that is where their value comes from. But neither of them were villains. They were just disconnected. And here's the part we don't always admit. Sometimes separation isn't about hate, it's about exhaustion. And exhaustion can make even good love feel heavy. Now, statistically, studies suggest that approximately 40 to 50% of married couples in the US divorce. Yep, I said it. But interestingly, research shows that nearly 50% of young adults report reconciling with an ex at least once. On again, off again relationships are more common than we like to admit. But frequency doesn't equal health. Just because many couples try again doesn't mean many couples heal. So before you romanticize reconciliation, ask yourself, was the separation about circumstance or character? Was it about timing or toxicity? Because if you don't understand why you left, you'll never understand whether going back makes sense. And we're just getting started, right? Now let's talk about the part nobody prepares you for after separation, which is what? The silence, the quiet house, the empty side of the bed, the fact that your phone isn't lighting up with their name anymore. And suddenly, what felt like clarity during the argument now feels like grief at midnight. This is where things get complicated because missing someone does not automatically mean you should be with them. And that right there, that's the part people don't like to hear. When couples separate, the brain doesn't just say, oh, okay, we're done. The brain goes into withdrawal. According to the Journal of Neurophysiology, romantic love activates the same reward pathways in the brain as addictive substances. Ain't that something, y'all? So yes, we are talking about the dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin levels that shift dramatically during attachment and breakups. So when you separate from someone you bonded with, your brain reacts almost like it's detoxing. You're not just emotionally sad, you're neurologically withdrawing. That's why you start remembering the good moments more than the painful ones. That's why you forget how frustrated you were and suddenly romanticize the vacation from 3 years ago. Your brain is trying to regulate itself. Now, let's bring a little attachment theory into this, shall we? The work of John Bowlby and later, yes, one of my favorites, Sue Johnson, teaches us that humans are wired for attachment. We crave emotional safety and connection. So when that attachment is disrupted, it can feel threatening, even if the relationship wasn't healthy. There are generally 4 attachment styles: secure, anxious, avoidant, and fearful avoidant. And if you haven't heard my earlier episodes in season 1, you might want to go back and listen to those. Because if you have an anxious attachment style, separation can feel unbearable. You may feel intense, longing, panic, and a desperate need to reconnect. If you lean avoidant, you might feel relief at first, only to feel loneliness creep in later when the distance becomes real. And here's where it gets tricky. Sometimes what you're missing isn't the person, it's the attachment. It's the familiarity, it's the routine, it's having someone who knew your coffee order and your childhood stories. Missing someone can be about love, but it can also be about comfort. So, I once worked with this other couple. We're going to call them Renee and Alicia. Yep, I'm going to use my own name, y'all. So, they were a same-sex couple who were together for about 5 years. They separated after ongoing arguments about emotional availability. When they split, Renee immediately wanted to reconcile. She said, I can't imagine life without her. But as we unpacked that statement in therapy, what she really meant was, I can't imagine starting over. That's different. Starting over requires vulnerability. It requires risking rejection. It requires dating again, building trust again, explaining your favorite color again. And let's be honest, dating in 2026? Woo, what a sport. Because I'm hearing that the water ain't got the right ingredients in it out there. So sometimes reconciliation feels easier than reinvention. But easy is not always healthy. Another layer to this is trauma bonding. And I know some of y'all just rolled your eyes at me because y'all like either she about to talk about me or she about to really put this into perspective because I've been trying to ignore these parts about my partner and she about to bring it to life. Yep, I sure am. Because a trauma bond occurs when intense emotional highs and lows create a powerful attachment cycle. The fights are explosive, the makeup is passionate, the breakup is dramatic, and the reunion feels like destiny. But what's actually happening is a cycle of intermittent reinforcement. You know, the same psychological principle that makes slot machines addictive. I think that just went over some people's heads. You don't know when you'll get the reward. So when you do, it feels euphoric, just like those slot machines. And if you're like me, you like roulette. I'm just saying. And if your relationship was full of extreme highs and devastating lows, the separation can feel unbearable, not because it was healthy, but because your nervous system got used to intensity. Intensity is not intimacy. Let me say that again for the people in the back, because y'all didn't hear me. Intensity is not intimacy. Real intimacy is steady. It's consistent. It's safe. It doesn't require chaos to feel alive. So when you're missing someone after separation, ask yourself gently, do I miss who they are, or do I miss how they made me feel when things were good? Do I miss them, or do I miss not being alone? And please hear me when I say this. There is no shame in loneliness. We are wired for connection. Missing someone does not make you weak. It makes you human. But humanity requires honesty. Am I right or am I wrong? So, the poet Rupi Kaur, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, wrote, and I quote, "Loneliness is a sign you are in desperate need of yourself." That's powerful, y'all. Because sometimes separation exposes the parts of us we've neglected, the hobbies we've stopped, the friendships we've deprioritized, the identity we shrank to maintain peace. So before you text your ex, "I miss you," pause and ask yourself, am I reaching for them? Am I avoiding myself? Because reconciliation built on avoidance will collapse again. But reconciliation built on self-awareness, well, that has potential. And that's where we're going next, because missing someone is emotional. But deciding to return, that requires wisdom. Can we go there? Because here's the million-dollar question. Do people really change? Or do they just say they will because they're scared to lose you? Because when separation happens and the distance becomes real, something shifts. The ego softens, the pride lowers. Suddenly, the person who said, "Fine, leave then," is now saying, "I've been thinking a lot." And thinking is good, but transformation, that's different. Change is not a feeling. Change is a pattern. And this is where a lot of reconciliations fall apart, because couples reunite based on promises instead of proof. I know some of y'all hate me right now, but it's okay, because I'm going to keep feeding you the truth. I've had partners sit in my office and say, "I swear I'll do better." And I always ask, what does better look like in behavior? Because "I'll communicate better" is vague. "I'll stop lying" is vague. "I'll try harder" is vague. Change requires specifics. Research from the Gottman Institute shows that successful long-term relationship repair depends heavily on accountability and what Dr. John Gottman calls repair attempts. Repair attempts are consistent actions that de-escalate conflict and rebuild trust. Not dramatic speeches, not grand gestures, small, repeated, reliable behaviors. And here's what's important. Words feel good in the moment. Behavior sustains safety. Let me tell you about a couple. I'm going to call them Devin and Marcus. They separated after Marcus repeatedly dismissed Devin's emotional concerns. Devin would say, "I feel unheard," and Marcus would respond with logic instead of empathy. Over time, Devin shut down. They separated. During that time apart, Marcus went to individual therapy, not because Devin forced him, but because he genuinely wanted to understand himself. He learned about emotional regulation. He practiced reflective listening. When they reconnected months later, he didn't just say, "I'm different." He demonstrated it in conversation, in tone, and in patience. That reconciliation had substance, y'all. Now compare that to what I call panic change. Yep, I said it. Panic change happens when someone feels the consequences of their behavior and scrambles to fix it, not because they understand the root of the issue, but because they fear abandonment. The changes feel intense at first. Flowers, apologies, daily check-ins, but once stability returns, the old habits quietly creep back in. And guess what? That's not growth. That's fear management. And listen, people absolutely can change. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, is well documented. Therapy works. Emotional intelligence can be learned. Communication skills can improve. But change requires discomfort. If someone isn't willing to sit in therapy, examine their childhood wounds, confront their defense mechanisms, and take responsibility without blaming you, then what's going to be different this time? Because reconciliation without self-worth is just repetition. Now, here's where it gets even more layered. Sometimes both partners contributed to the breakdown, not equally, but relationally. Relationships are systems, and according to family systems theory, when one part of the system shifts, the entire system must recalibrate. So, if you separated because of conflict cycles, criticism followed by defensiveness, followed by shutdown, both of you have to interrupt that dance, not just one. The question isn't, do they miss me? The question is, have we both evolved? There's a powerful quote from Esther Perel that says, "The quality of your relationships determine the quality of your life." But she also talks about how modern relationships often require us to have multiple relationships with the same person over time. Meaning this, if you're going to reconcile, the old relationship must end. You cannot return to version 1.0. You have to build version 2.0. And that requires grief. It requires acknowledging what didn't work. It requires apologizing for specific harm. It requires new boundaries. If the reunion conversation sounds like, "Let's just move forward and not talk about the past," then that's avoidance. Healing talks about the past, so it doesn't repeat itself. And I want to gently challenge something here, if I can. Sometimes when we ask, do people really change? What we're really asking is, will they finally become who I hoped they were? That's different. Because reconciliation should not be about potential. It should be about reality. Are you returning to who they are now or who you wish they'd become? If you need someone to become a completely different personality in order for it to work, That's not growth. That's incompatibility. And incompatibility isn't failure, it's clarity. But if both of you have done the work, real work, not Instagram quote work, if there's emotional maturity, consistent accountability, and a willingness to build something new instead of recreating something broken, then yes, people can change. But change is proven over time, not during one emotional conversation at 11:47 p.m. And if you're considering reconciliation, ask yourself, what evidence do I have that this time will be different? Not hope, not chemistry, not nostalgia. Evidence. Because love deserves more than promises. It deserves progress. And now we have to talk about something deeper, something many of us don't even realize is influencing our decision to return. Yep, you already know your generational patterns. So, can we go there? Can we go a little deeper? Because this part right here, this is where things get extremely uncomfortable for some people. Because sometimes the decision to reconcile has less to do with your current partner and more to do with you, your childhood. Yes, I said it. Before you ever fell in love, before you ever got married, before you ever said, I'm done, you were already being shaped by what you saw growing up. Family systems theory tells us that relationship patterns are often transmitted across generations. We learn how to argue, how to apologize, how to love, how to detach, and how to tolerate dysfunction long before we realize we're learning anything at all. If you grew up watching your parents separate and reunite multiple times, that cycle can feel normal. If you watch one parent stay in marriage filled with betrayal for the kids, you might equate endurance with loyalty. If conflict in your home was explosive and dramatic, calm relationships may feel boring instead of safe. And here's the hard truth. Familiar doesn't always mean healthy. Sometimes reconciliation feels right because it feels known. So I once worked with this couple. We're going to call them Erica and Thomas. They separated after years of conflict, but when they considered reconciling, Erica kept saying, marriage is hard. My parents stayed together through worse. As we unpacked that statement she made, she realized her mother endured chronic emotional neglect and normalized it as commitment. Erica wasn't just deciding whether to return to Thomas. She was reenacting a script she inherited. And scripts are powerful. Research consistently shows that children who witness high conflict marriages are more likely to experience unstable adult relationships. That doesn't mean it's destiny, but it does mean patterns have gravity. Now, let's also acknowledge culture and faith here. In many communities, Black, Latino, Asian, religious, immigrant families, separation can carry stigma. There may be pressure to make it work, to avoid shame, to maintain family image. For LGBTQ plus couples, there can be an added layer of, we fought so hard for this relationship, we can't let it fail. That pressure can make reconciliation feel like proof of strength, even when it might not be safe. So the question becomes, are you choosing reconciliation freely, or are you responding to inherited expectations? Because sometimes going back feels like obedience. And sometimes leaving feels like betrayal, even when it's self-preservation. Now let's talk about the staying for the kids narrative, shall we? Research is nuanced here. Children benefit from stable, loving environments, but stability does not equal two parents under the same roof at any cost. High conflict homes often produce more anxiety in children than cooperative co-parenting and separate homes. I said it. I know some of y'all out there co-parenting are rolling your eyes at me tonight. It's okay. Because if reconciliation is built on ongoing hostility, silent resentment, or emotional coldness, children absorb that energy. They learn that love is tense. They learn that silence is normal. They learn that affection is conditional. And we don't mean to teach that, but we do. Generational patterns also show up in attachment. If your caregivers were inconsistent, you may cling harder in adult relationships. If they were emotionally unavailable, you may detach first to avoid vulnerability. So when separation happens, you're not just reacting to your partner, you're reacting from your inner child. That's why reconciliation decisions feel so charged. You're not just asking, do I love them? You're asking, is this abandonment? You're asking, am I failing? You're asking, will I regret this like my mother did? And those questions are heavy. There's a quote from Maya Angelou that says, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Generational healing is about knowing better. Maybe reconciliation is your do better. Maybe letting go is. But whatever you choose, let it be conscious. Let it be examined. Let it be yours, not just inherited. Because reconciliation rooted in awareness can break unhealthy cycles. But reconciliation rooted in obligation will recreate them. And now that we've talked about psychology and generational patterns, it's time to get very practical, y'all. Because sometimes the signs are right in front of you. Yep, you already know where I'm going. Let's talk about red flags. The ones people ignore when nostalgia starts getting loud. All right, let's talk about the part people try to skip here. Now, I want you to lean in for this part because nostalgia is powerful. Loneliness is persuasive. Chemistry is convincing. But red flags? They don't disappear just because you miss someone. They just get quieter. And one of the biggest mistakes couples make when reconsidering reconciliation is minimizing the very issues that cause the separation. So let's walk through this honestly. The first major red flag is reconciliation without accountability. If the conversation sounds like, we both made mistakes, let's just move forward, but there's no clear ownership of specific behaviors, that's avoidance dressed up as maturity. Accountability sounds like this. I lied. I dismissed you. I avoided therapy. I choose work over us. Not, you know how I get. Not, we were both toxic. Not, that's just how relationships are. Research from the American Psychological Association emphasizes that behavioral change requires recognition of one's role in relational distress. If someone cannot clearly articulate their part in the breakdown, they cannot sustainably repair it either. I'm going to let that one sit right there. Second red flag, love bombing after separation. Y'all know I just got finished talking about that. Previous episode. You know what I'm talking about here. Suddenly there are flowers, long texts, apologies, deep reflections, promises of therapy, grand gestures, and it feels intoxicating because it's everything you've wanted before. But here's the key question. Why did it take losing you to unlock this version of them? Sometimes separation wakes people up. That's real. But sometimes the intensity is about regaining control, not creating stability. Love bombing often fades once security returns. Consistency is what matters, not intensity. Remember what we said earlier. Intensity is not intimacy, right? Okay. Third red flag, fear-based returning. I know some of y'all never heard that before, but it's okay, because you're about to learn it today. If your primary thought is, what if I don't find anyone better? Or, I've already invested so much time, that's scarcity talking. Healthy reconciliation is rooted in desire, not fear. You should be choosing them, not settling for them. I'm just saying. Another serious red flag is isolation from your support system. If your friends and family consistently express concern, and not because they're petty, but because they've witnessed patterns, you need to pause. Now, I'm not saying your friends get veto power here. I'm not saying you got to listen to your family either. But if reconciliation requires you to hold details, defend behavior constantly, or distance yourself from people who care about you, that's not growth, that's control. And let's be clear here. If the separation involved abuse, emotional, physical, sexual, financial, reconciliation requires extreme caution and professional support. The cycle of abuse often includes tension building, incident, reconciliation, and calm. That reconciliation phase can feel incredibly loving and hopeful, but without intervention, the cycle repeats. If safety was ever compromised, love alone is not enough to fix that. I need to say that plainly, right? Love doesn't override safety. Now, here's another subtle red flag. Because I don't know, I think that last comment just went over some of y'all heads. But the subtle red flag is minimizing the original problem. If infidelity happened and now the conversation is, it was just one time, let's not dwell. That's not repair. If chronic emotional neglect happened and now it's, I'll try harder, without therapy or skill building, that's not change. Repair requires depth, not surface level comfort. Can I tell you about a couple I worked with? We're going to call them Danielle and Chris. They separated after repeated financial dishonesty. Chris would hide spending, open credit lines, and avoid conversations about money. After separation, he came back apologetic and affectionate. But when we discuss concrete financial transparency measures, joint budgeting apps, financial counseling, shared account access, he resisted. He wanted emotional forgiveness without structural change. That reconciliation failed. Because without structural change, emotional promises collapse. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If the issue that caused the separation still exists in the same form, reconciliation will only delay another breakup. And sometimes the red flag isn't them. Sometimes it's us. If you are returning because you feel unworthy of better, that's a red flag. If you are returning because you struggle to tolerate loneliness, that's a red flag. And if you are returning because you believe love requires suffering, well, guess what? That's a huge red flag, because you deserve peace, not just passion. You deserve consistency, not just chemistry. Now listen, I'm not anti-reconciliation. I've seen beautiful reunions. I've seen couples rebuild stronger than before. But those stories always have something in common, which is humility, work, time, and evidence. If reconciliation feels rushed, secretive, chaotic, or driven by fear, pause. Take a big pause. Because love should feel grounded, not frantic. And now that we've talked through red flags, I want to balance this conversation. Because there are some green flags too. There are signs that say this might actually work. And if you're considering giving love another chance, you need to know what those look like too. So let's talk about them. But let's take a breather for a second, because I know I've been dropping some bombs on y'all tonight. Because after red flags, some of y'all were probably sitting there like, well, dang. Should anybody ever get back together? Well, the answer to that is yes. Sometimes you should. but not for the reasons we're used to. Now, green flags aren't your butterflies. They aren't, we had a good conversation. And they aren't, they said they miss me. Green flags are measurable. They're observable. They're consistent. The first green flag here, individual growth that happened without pressure. If the separation led to therapy, self-reflection, boundary work, accountability, or even lifestyle changes, and it happened before reconciliation conversations began, that matters. Growth that happens only when you threaten to leave is reactive. Growth that happens because someone recognizes their patterns is transformative. Don't believe me? All right, well, let me use this couple as an example. We're going to call them Tasha and Lauren, who separated after years of unresolved resentment. During their time apart, they didn't talk for 3 months. Tasha entered therapy to address her emotional shutdown patterns. Lauren joined a communication skills group to better manage her defensiveness. When they reconnected, neither came back saying, "You need to change." They came back saying, "Here's what I learned about myself." That's a green flag. Self-awareness is attractive. Humility is powerful, right? Okay. Well, another green flag here is emotional regulation. If the arguments that once escalated quickly now slow down, if voices stay calm, if pauses happen instead of explosions, that's growth. The Gottman Institute talks about something called physiological flooding, which happens when heart rates spike during conflict and rational conversation shuts down. Couples who learn to self-soothe and return to conversations calmly have significantly higher relationship satisfaction. So, if during reconnection you notice that conflict feels different, less reactive, more reflective, that's not small. That's structural change. Another green flag is transparent conversations about the past. If both of you are willing to sit down and talk about what hurt, without minimizing, without deflecting, without "you always," that's maturity. Reconciliation requires naming the wound before trying to close it. It sounds like, "I felt abandoned when you shut down. I felt criticized when you raised your voice. I betrayed your trust and I understand why it changed how you see me." That's uncomfortable. But healing lives in discomfort. All right, another major green flag here is boundaries. Yes, boundaries inside reconciliation. Because version 2.0 should not look like version 1.0. If one partner struggled with overworking, maybe there are now non-negotiable date nights. If one partner crossed emotional boundaries with others, maybe there are new transparency agreements. If family interference was an issue, maybe there are new boundaries around in-laws. I know some of y'all are like, "Oh, no, she didn't." Yep, I put it out there, especially for some of y'all that got mama issues. I'm just saying, put some boundaries up. Because reconciliation that includes new structure is promising. Reconciliation that says, "Let's just try again and see what happens," is risky. Now, here's one that might surprise you. A green flag is not rushing. If both of you agree to rebuild slowly, dating again intentionally, attending couples therapy, checking in consistently instead of jumping straight back into old patterns, that shows intentionality. Because love is not proven by speed. It's proven by stability. I remember working with this married couple, we're going to call them Andre and Miguel, who separated after infidelity. When they decided to try again, they didn't move back in immediately. They started with weekly therapy. They rebuilt emotional intimacy before physical intimacy. They created a 6-month reconciliation plan with milestones. It wasn't romantic in the Hollywood sense. but it was healthy. And 6 months later, they were stronger than before, not because the betrayal disappeared, but because the repair was intentional. Another green flag here: freedom. Love it. Because if you feel free to choose reconciliation, not pressured, not guilted, not coerced, that matters deeply. Healthy reconciliation feels like empowerment, not obligation. You should feel calm more than anxious, hopeful more than panicked, grounded more than frantic. And here's a subtle but powerful sign. When you imagine being back together, do you feel peace? Or do you feel adrenaline? Peace is sustainable. Adrenaline is addictive. And I want to gently say something here. Sometimes the green flag is both of you admitting we needed that separation. Sometimes space clarifies love. Sometimes absence exposes patterns. Sometimes distance allows you to see each other without the daily noise. Reconciliation isn't weakness. It can be wisdom, but only if it's rooted in growth. Now, let's talk about something that often feels impossible after separation, and that's trust. Because even if you decide to try again, rebuilding trust is its own journey. And if trust isn't rebuilt properly, the relationship will live on eggshells. Let's talk about how to rebuild it the right way. Because here's the reality. Love might bring you back together, but trust determines whether you stay. And trust is slow. Trust is earned in moments when no one is watching. Trust is built in consistency, not apologies. When couples reconcile after separation, there's often a honeymoon phase. You're careful, you're affectionate, you're hopeful, but underneath that hope can be anxiety that shows up in questions like, are they really different? Will this happen again? Am I foolish for trying? Trust repair requires more than reassurance. It requires transparency. If infidelity was involved, emotional, physical, financial, then rebuilding trust means creating new systems. That might include shared passwords for a season, location sharing, financial transparency, open access to devices, and before someone says, that's invasive, let me clarify something. Transparency after betrayal is not punishment. It's stabilization. Research in emotionally focused therapy developed by Sue Johnson shows that betrayal ruptures attachment security. And attachment security is rebuilt when consistent, responsive behaviors reestablish safety. Safety is not assumed, it's demonstrated. Now, let's also address forgiveness. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. You can forgive someone and never return. You can return and still be working toward forgiveness. Forgiveness is internal. Reconciliation is relational. And sometimes people rush forgiveness because they want peace. But forgiveness without processing creates resentment later. If you're reconciling, it's okay to say, I'm still healing. I still get triggered. I need reassurance sometimes. Trust repair is not linear. There will be good weeks and then random emotional waves. A song, a memory, a date, something will trigger the old pain. And what matters is how your partner responds in those moments. If they say you're still on that, that's dismissal. If they say I understand why that's hard, that's repair. Trust is rebuilt when someone consistently shows up in the places they once failed. Another major piece of trust repair is reliability. If someone says they'll call at 6 p.m., they call at 6 p.m. If someone says they'll attend therapy, guess what they're going to do? Attend therapy. If someone says they'll limit certain friendships or behaviors, guess what they do? They follow through. Reliability rebuilds safety because broken trust often creates hypervigilance. The nervous system becomes alert, small inconsistencies feel big, and instead of shaming the anxious partner for being paranoid, the work is to create predictability. Predictability calms the nervous system. So let me tell you about a couple I work with. We're going to call this one Simone and Derek. After Derek's emotional affair, Simone struggled deeply with trust. They reconciled, but Simone was sometimes asked to see his phone. Instead of getting defensive, Derek would hand it over calmly, not forever, but long enough to rebuild security. Over time, Simone asked less and less to see his phone. Trust wasn't rebuilt through speeches. It was rebuilt through steady access. Now, here's something else people don't talk about. Physical intimacy after separation can feel complicated. There may be desire, there may be hesitation, there may be comparison if other partners were involved. Rebuilding intimacy requires emotional safety first. If you rush physical closeness to prove things are better, you risk bypassing emotional repair. Intimacy after separation should feel intentional, not desperate. And here's the deeper layer. Trust is also about self-trust. Do you trust yourself to leave if patterns return? Because part of reconciliation strength is knowing you will not tolerate the same harm again. You're not coming back powerless. You're coming back wiser. And that changes the dynamic. Now, before we move into the practical questions you absolutely must ask before getting back together, I want to pause and acknowledge something. Reconciliation is not about pretending the separation didn't happen. It's about letting the separation teach you something. And if it taught you nothing, that's a problem. So let's get practical. If you're considering getting back together, there are some questions that can save you months or years of repeated pain. Let's walk through them honestly. All right, this is the part where we take the romance out of it and bring in the wisdom. Now, I'm about to give you questions that might feel uncomfortable, but discomfort now is better than devastation later. If you are considering reconciliation, you need clarity, not vibes, not chemistry, not we've been talking again and it feels nice. I said clarity, right? So the first question is simple but powerful. What specifically causes the separation? What specifically caused the separation? Not the surface answer. Not, we were arguing a lot. Be specific. Was it emotional neglect? Was it dishonesty? Was it lack of intimacy? Was it financial stress? Was it unresolved trauma? If you cannot clearly name the issue, you cannot clearly fix it. And here's the follow-up. This question you want to ask. Has that issue actually been addressed? Not talked about, addressed. There's a difference. Talking about something is awareness. Addressing it is action. If the separation was caused by communication breakdown, have you both learned new communication skills? If it was caused by infidelity, has there been therapy and transparency? If it was caused by emotional immaturity, has there been individual growth? Hope is not a strategy. Let's be clear, y'all. The next question is one I ask couples all the time. What would make this relationship different this time? And I want details. And I make my clients give me details. Surrounding different how? Different when conflict happens? Different when stress increases? Different when attraction fluctuates? Question. If your answer is simply, we love each other, that's not enough. Love existed before the separation. So love alone didn't sustain it. Okay. Another powerful question in this is, are we choosing each other freely or are we afraid of being alone? Now, I need you to really sit with that because loneliness is persuasive. It gets you to thinking. It gets you stuck. And I want y'all to know that research shows that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. So yes, separation hurts, but pain can push us toward relief instead of reflection. Are you going back because you genuinely believe the partnership is healthier now, or because dating again feels exhausting? Be honest. I'm going to leave that one right there. I'm going to let y'all think about that while we move on to the next question that most people rarely ask, which is, have we forgiven each other, or are we quietly keeping score? If you're reconciling while still collecting evidence of wrongdoing, the relationship will feel tense. If every disagreement triggers, "This is why we broke up," then the wound hasn't healed yet. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means you are not weaponizing the past. I don't know if some of y'all just heard me on this one, but you cannot keep score and think that after reconciling that relationship is going to work out. It is already a recipe for disaster. All right. I'm going to give y'all a big one. What boundaries are we putting in place to protect this version of us? I bet you some of y'all ain't asked that question. Because reconciliation without boundaries is just repetition. Maybe that boundary is couples therapy. Maybe it's weekly check-ins. Maybe it's financial transparency. Maybe it's clear expectations around emotional labor. But if nothing is structurally different, you're relying on willpower alone. And willpower fades. I'm just saying. I also want y'all to ask yourselves, if nothing changed from how it was before, would I still choose this relationship? Would I still choose this person? Because sometimes we reconcile based on imagined potential instead of present reality. There's a quote from Maya Angelou that says, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." How many of y'all heard that? I'm not saying people can't grow, but if someone has consistently shown you avoidance, dishonesty, or emotional unavailability, and there's no concrete evidence of work done, you have to believe the pattern. Reconciliation should be based on who they are, not who you hope they'll become. If I had enough wisdom, y'all would have caught that. And finally, here's a question that feels simple but reveals everything. When I imagine our future, do I feel peace? Not butterflies, peace. Because butterflies can come from anxiety. Peace comes from safety. If I'm imagining a future together that feels grounding, steady, hopeful, that's meaningful. If imagining it feels like bracing for impact, pay attention to that, honey. Your body often knows before your brain admits it. Now listen, these questions aren't meant to scare you away from reconciliation. They're meant to protect you. They're meant to make you think. Because going back is not the failure. Going back blindly is. And sometimes, after answering these questions honestly, you might realize something unexpected. You might realize that the separation gave you clarity, not reconciliation. You might realize that loving someone doesn't always mean being with them. And that brings us to one of the hardest truths in relationships. Sometimes the real growth is letting go. Let's talk about that. Let's sit with the part that doesn't get romanticized. Y'all might want to top your glasses off again for this one, because this one about to get extremely real. Because as much as we've talked about reconciliation tonight, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not go back. And that doesn't mean the love wasn't real. It doesn't mean the memories were fake. It doesn't mean the years were wasted. It just means that love and compatibility are not the same thing. There's a difference between loving someone and thriving with someone. You can love someone deeply and still recognize that the dynamic between you two brings out insecurity, defensiveness, anxiety, or emotional shrinking. You can love someone and still admit that your futures don't align. You can love someone and realize that the version of you that existed in that relationship is not who you want to be anymore. And that realization, that's maturity. One of the hardest things I tell couples in therapy is this: closure does not always come through reunion. Sometimes closure comes through acceptance. We live in a culture that glorifies, we found our way back to each other. And yes, sometimes that story is beautiful, but we don't talk enough about the equally powerful story of we loved each other and we let each other go. Because letting go requires grieving not just the person, but the future you imagined. You know, the holidays you pictured, the home you talked about, the children you may have named, the version of yourselves that felt forever. Grief is layered. And sometimes reconciliation conversations are really grief avoidance. It's easier to try again than to mourn fully. But incomplete grief turns into unfinished attachment. Y'all know I'm about to give y'all a couple on this one to bring this one home. We're going to call them Nadia and Elise. And this couple separated after 5 years together. There was no betrayal, no major conflict, just different life visions emerging. Nadia wanted children soon, while Elise did not. They loved each other fiercely. When they considered reconciling, their primary reason was, we don't want to lose this. But love doesn't erase fundamental differences. In therapy, they realized that reconciliation would require one of them to sacrifice something deeply important. And sacrifice of core values often leads to resentment later. So they chose to let go with respect. It was painful, but it was honest. And here's something I want you to hear clearly. Letting go is not failure. It's clarity. It's choosing alignment over attachment. It's trusting that just because something ended doesn't mean it was meaningless. Sometimes the relationship was a chapter, not a whole book. There's a quote often attributed to C.S. Lewis that says, "You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending." Sometimes changing the ending means reconciliation. Sometimes it means release. If reconciliation requires you to shrink, silence yourself, ignore patterns, or accept less than peace, then letting go is growth. If reconciliation feels like evolution, healing, and building something new, then trying again may be wisdom. The key is honesty, not fear, not loneliness, not nostalgia. Honesty. Because here's the truth. You deserve a relationship that feels secure, reciprocal, and safe, not just familiar. And whether that relationship is with your ex or someone new, the standard should remain the same. Healthy love. Now let's bring this home, because I want to leave you with something that grounds you, not confuses you. Let's close this out the right way. From separation to reconciliation. Is getting back together a good idea? The real answer is, it depends. It depends on growth. It depends on accountability. It depends on whether the separation taught you something or just scared you. Love deserves depth. Love deserves maturity. Love deserves evolution. If you're considering reconciliation, don't rush. Don't romanticize. Don't ignore red flags because the chemistry feels familiar. Ask hard questions. Demand evidence. Check your patterns. Examine your generational scripts. Listen to your body. Choose peace over panic, because getting back together should feel intentional, not desperate. And whether you rebuild or release, let the decision be conscious. Let it reflect who you are now, not who you were when the relationship broke. Sometimes separation is the end. Sometimes it's the pause that makes rebuilding possible. But either way, you deserve a love story rooted in growth, not repetition. And if today's conversation stirred something in you, I want you to sit with it, journal about it, pray about it, talk to a therapist or a relationship coach about it. Don't let the decision be reactive. Let it be refined. Thank you for pouring this wine with me tonight. And if you're feeling the love, the realness, and the controversy of this episode, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Hearts Wine from Hearts Distractions on YouTube. Visit my website, www.aliciasdistractions.com. Purchase a copy of my poetry book, Distractions of the Heart, on Amazon. And of course, follow me on social media, on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. And remember, whether you reconcile or release, whether you rebuild or redefine, make sure the love you choose also chooses your growth. Until next time, cheers!